very pleased to be introduced as an ambassador, but not for the reasons you would think. It always makes me happy to think back on it for family reasons, basically. This was about 16 years ago. My son is 32 now. He was almost 16 then. And if you remember teenage boys, some of you might have been teenage boys, it's not the easiest period of time. They're not all that communicative, and I was traveling too much anyway. So I tried to spend as much time with him as possible. But usually I was just driving him places. And that didn't make him very happy because he was almost 16. So one day I was driving him to a soccer game, and the silence in the car was so thick you could cut it with a dull knife. There was nothing going on, even though he had a friend in the car. Suddenly, from the back seat of the car, I hear a voice. My dad's an ambassador. And then another silence. But they didn't give him a country. It's another silence. But if Bill Clinton's reelected, they'll give him a country. But he won't take it because I have to finish high school. And that was the high spot of my ambassadorial service. But the other thing about my ambassadorial service, I always thank Bill Clinton, President Clinton, for nominating me for ambassador. But the truth is, I owe it to the Japanese. I was going to be the trade negotiator with the Japanese on autos and auto parts, which was a big issue at the time. And one day, Mickey Cantor, the trade representative, came into my office and he said, "They won't meet with you." I said, "Really? Usually people have to know me to dislike me. This is kind of odd." He said, "They won't meet with you. You're not high enough rank." I said, "Oh, okay." He said, Mickey said, "So I'm going to ask Bill Clinton, the president, to make you an ambassador." I said, "Works for me." But it was the Japanese who did it for me, and I've always owed it to them. I worked 12 years in the Senate and got out of there at the end of 1987. There are a lot of people that stayed longer, but I was in the majority and the minority. I was personal staff and professional staff, committee staff, leadership staff. I did domestic and foreign policy, so I had a pretty good exposure to the Senate. And I'd fallen in love with it long before that because I was an intern in the Senate as far back as 1969, one day after graduating college. And so I've always loved the Senate. So I left in 1987 and went on to do other things. Fast forward to 2008. We're in the midst of that exciting presidential campaign with Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, John McCain, later Sarah Palin, and a group of us who had worked together 30 years before in the Senate came back to have breakfast regularly just to talk about the campaign because we were so excited about it. And then we would turn to the Senate. How wonderful it had been and how it had become completely unrecognizable to us. Polarized, paralyzed, dysfunctional. The world's greatest legislative body had become what George Packer in the New Yorker called the empty chamber. And I walked out of one of those breakfasts and I said, "That's it. I'm going to write a book about the Senate when it was great." Now, when you decide to do something like that, there's a couple of threshold problems. Was it really great? Did it only seem great because I had worked there? Did it only seem great because I had been young? Memory has a way of playing tricks on you, and everyone likes to think they were part of some kind of golden era. But fortunately for me, I had discovered something that was in plain sight but hadn't been noticed. If you Google the words Great Senate, you'll find nothing except my book. Nobody ever noticed there was a great Senate. I call the book The Last Great Senate. It may have been the first great Senate or the only great Senate. But after I wrote the book, the reviewers started saying, "Well, today we have a terrible Senate. But in the 1960s and 70s, we had a great Senate. They accepted my premise, and I think the premise was right. For a period of time, less than about 20 years, almost 20 years, from the early 1960s through 1980, America had a great Senate. It was a Senate that was in the forefront of everything that was going on in the country. You can't think about the civil rights acts of that time, the anti-war movement, the debate over Vietnam, Watergate, holding Richard Nixon accountable, all the consumer and energy legislation, environmental breakthroughs, women's rights advances. You can't think about any of those things without the Senate in the forefront at a time of crisis in our country, a time of assassinations, civil violence, the war, scandals, 5 presidents who didn't serve 2 full terms, from Kennedy to Carter. The Senate stepped up. The Senate of Hubert Humphrey and Ed Muskie, Howard Baker, Ted Kennedy, Robert Kennedy. The names, Robert Dole, Walter Mondale, the names can go on forever. They're still revered in their states and in Washington. So the other thing, that Senate contrasted very much with what we have today. But it also contrasted with what came before it. Before that Senate, the Senate had been a reactionary body. It was a block on the nation's progress for most of the 20th century. The Senate was described by historian Robert Caro, the great political historian, as the only place where the South didn't lose the Civil War. The South's unending revenge for Gettysburg. There was a time, not long before this book was written, not long before the period of this book, that 8 committees of the Senate were chaired by senators from 4 states: Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Arkansas. They dominated the Senate. It was a reactionary body. It stymied the work of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman when they were president. Lyndon Johnson dragged the Senate, kicking and screaming, into the 20th century when he was majority leader. But my argument is that the Senate only got great after Johnson was vice president. The Senate had a different leader in Mike Mansfield in Montana, a very quiet man, sort of an anti-politician, who built a Senate based on trust, respect, and bipartisanship. So, if this Senate that I'm claiming was great, what made it great? The first thing was, it was in fact Tom Brokaw's greatest generation. It was made up of men, and they were overwhelmingly, at that time, all but one, men who had served in World War II, who came back to their states and became leaders in their political parties and rose to the Senate. They had a sense of common purpose that they came out of the war with. They had a sense of America's greatness and a willingness to face its weaknesses, particularly the discrimination against African Americans. They didn't think that casting a hard vote was the toughest thing they'd ever done, since they'd been at Normandy and Iwo Jima and the Battle of the Bulge. And the World War II bled right into the Cold War, which was an existential threat to the country. So that sense of common purpose was fundamental to what they were about. But they also had a concept of being a senator. They realized the great honor that they had. These 6-year terms, usually multiple 6-year terms, the right to range broadly over all the issues, foreign and domestic. And in return for that, when they sorted out the pressures on them, yeah, they were members of parties, and they represented their states vigorously. But what they really focused on was the national interest. That was what they were there for. That was what it was about. Years before John McCain's famous phrase, country first, that's what they believed they were in the Senate for. And so they would have these fierce debates, but they would bring them to a conclusion. Filibusters were rare. They were real, but they were rare. People didn't put holds on nominations and legislation. They didn't have straight party votes. The place was pretty much a demilitarized zone where partisanship was concerned. When we worked there, they would, if you worked for a Democrat, you had some great idea, you'd go to the senator and tell him about it, and he'd say, find a Republican. That's how we did things. And there were Republicans to find, because the parties weren't that far apart at the time, and they were conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. So there was overlap. They also had a different concept of the Senate. Their concept of the Senate was, it was an institution to take collective action. It wasn't there just for their own personal agendas. Mike Mansfield, the leader, said, it's the Senate, the institution, that's the rock of the republic. That's what matters. And for that reason, they didn't, for the most part, obstruct. They got things done. So let me just tell a few examples, because the book is entitled The Last Great Senate, Courage and Statesmanship in Times of Crisis. So I'll give you just a few examples of courage and statesmanship. And first, before I do that, I left out one thing. So I was getting ready to write this book, and I think I had found a publisher, which is really important. And we're getting ready to get a contract, and the publisher says, just a few things. Number one, this is not a memoir. Nobody's interested in your memoirs. I said, okay. Can I pop up in the book once or twice? He said, twice. And those are the best parts, by the way. But number two, he said, it's not political science. There's room for political science, but what sells is narrative history. You have to tell the story. I said, okay, I can do it. I'll tell stories. And the third thing is, don't write about the whole 20 years. Find a different way to tell it. So I walked out. My agent said to me, you must be discouraged. I said, no, actually, I feel kind of liberated. That 20 years was getting hard to walk through. How much could I add to Vietnam and civil rights and all these other things that have been written about? And on the train on the way home from New York, I figured out another way to tell the story. So the story's about the last years of the Great Senate. It's the beginning of America's third century. We've got a new president, Jimmy Carter, who's the outsider president. New Senate leaders, Robert Byrd and Howard Baker. And then the problems of normal political life. Economic weakness, energy crises, foreign policy disasters. And Jimmy Carter said recently, Barack Obama's facing a lot of the same problems that I faced when I was president, but I had one advantage. I had a Congress that I could work with on a bipartisan basis. And by that he meant the Senate. He had a Senate that he could work with. So just a couple of stories. Rather than give away the book, I'll just tell a couple to illustrate the kind of people we're talking about. Howard Baker, senator from Tennessee, has just become Republican leader when the book starts. Very gifted politician. If the senators ever voted for president in a secret ballot, Baker would win overwhelmingly. He was that good. So, and by the way, Lee Annis of Montgomery College, one of the other campuses, I relied very heavily on Lee Annis's biography of Howard Baker, which is just one of the most terrific political biographies. Thank you for being here, Lee. "97% of what I know about Howard Baker is from Lee Annis. The other 3% is one thing I did with Howard Baker once. So Baker becomes leader, and he really hopes that he'll be president someday. Jimmy Carter says to the new leaders of the Congress, I'd like to negotiate a new treaty governing access to the Panama Canal. This is already a hot political issue. 5 presidents have thought about it, and they've passed it by. Ronald Reagan almost takes the Republican nomination for president based on the Panama Canal issue. It's our canal. We're not giving it back. So Carter's saying something that's not very popular. Baker's staff says to him, Senator, if you do this, you'll never be president. Republicans will never nominate you. And Baker basically says, I know, I understand that, but what's in the national interest? If this is important to do, I'm the Senate leader. I'm not running for president right now. And Howard Baker takes the lead in getting the Panama Canal treaties through the Senate by a vote. It wouldn't have happened without him. He never becomes president, but we remember him as one of the greatest Senate leaders of all time. That's one. Second thing that I like to talk about, New York City was in a fiscal crisis at the time, 1978. They had gotten some money from the federal government in 1975, but they needed more, except the Senate was completely opposed to it. The chairman of the banking committee of the Senate was a man named William Proxmire. Some of the older people here will remember that Proxmire was the original maverick. Proxmire ran 5 miles to and from work long before it was fashionable. He cast 10,000 straight votes. He hated federal spending. He never raised any money for his campaigns. He was the first person any of us knew who got hair transplants, which doesn't seem like that bad an idea now. In any event, he was completely opposed to giving money to New York City. But he said, I'll give the city the chance to make its case. And New York came in with a new mayor, Ed Koch, a great governor, Hugh Carey, and the 2 best urban senators perhaps that ever served, Jacob Javits and Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And they turned the Senate around. The hearings are unbelievable to read. People actually listening, learning, changing their minds, debating. And so the Senate, the committee overwhelmingly goes against Chairman Proxmire. And Proxmire says, they say to him, well, who's going to manage the bill on the Senate floor? He says, I'll do it. They say, Mr. Chairman, you're against it. You lost. He says, doesn't matter. I can do it. He goes to the Senate floor and he says, basically, I think bailing out New York is a terrible idea. But if you're going to bail out New York, this is the best legislation that can do it. That's how they did things. They figured out ways to get it done. Different people came forward and stepped up. They listened to each other. They debated. They had character. They were focused on the national interest. One last quick story. Henry Jackson of Washington was a very powerful senator, well known for his hatred of the Soviet Union, but a great senator in many respects. Henry Jackson hated Jimmy Carter. And Carter had defeated him for the nomination, had thwarted his hopes of ever being president. Jackson hated Carter. And he's the chairman of the Energy Committee, and energy was the #1 domestic issue. Jackson worked every day on energy policy with the Carter administration. For 3 years he worked on a national energy policy. He made compromise after compromise. They finally produced an energy policy. It didn't matter that he hated Carter. He respected the presidency. He knew what he was there for. That was the way it functioned. So, by now, you might be saying, particularly the older people. That sounds like a pretty interesting book. I remember some of those people. But the real question is, or the real questions are, what happened? What happened to that Senate? How did we lose it? And how do we, more important perhaps, how do we get it back? And the reason it's more important is this. The Senate, at its best, is what Walter Mondale called the nation's mediator. It's the place where the parties come together. It's the place where people of ideological differences come together. It's the place where the regions came together. It's where things got worked out. The nation's mediator. That's at its best. At its worst, it's the poisonous partisanship of the House of Representatives coupled with the Senate's paralyzing rules. It's the place that paralyzes the government. It's the Senate we've seen recently. It's the Senate that I would argue has been in decline for 20 years. So, what happened? The great Senate that I wrote about shattered in 1980. Ronald Reagan came in. His coattails were very long when he won a landslide victory. He brought in some of the worst senators of all time. People who we remember not at all. Paula Hawkins, Jeremiah Denton, Mac Mattingly, John East. Who are these people? They came for 6 years with no accomplishments and left with their record intact. And they replaced some of the greatest senators of all time. McGovern, Bayh, Javits, Ribicoff, Muskie, people who either lost or retired. Great senators all left. But the story wasn't done yet. The Senate still had a lot of good senators, and they got back together. And in the 80s, it worked more like the Senate was supposed to work. And then in the 1990s, it started down. And it's been going down for close to 20 years. And the key time that it started going down is when Newt Gingrich and his Senate friends, led by Trent Lott, took over the Congress in 1994. And this will surprise you, I'm a Democrat. But the book is not a partisan book because it's an ode to bipartisanship. And my analysis of what happened in the last 30 years, which is all in the epilogue, my analysis is shared by a lot of Republicans. Al Simpson, who we hear about because of Simpson Bowles, was a Republican from Wyoming. Al Simpson said to me, the Senate changed when the battered children of the House came over, led by Trent Lott. John Danforth, who was a Republican from Missouri, was much more critical of the Republicans than I was. He attacked them as captives of the Christian right. So my analysis isn't that remarkable anymore, because everyone shares it. But two things that need to be said about our politics. Two particular things. The first is the partisan divide got very wide. What I said before, the Democrats and the Republicans were closer together in the 60s and the 70s, without question. There were moderate to liberal Republicans all through the Northeast and the Midwest, and there were conservative Democrats in the South, and it made it easier to reach compromises. So the partisan divide is a problem as the Republicans keep moving further and further to the right. The second thing, though, is what we have come to call the permanent campaign. Used to be, you had a campaign, it wasn't that long, you governed right up to the end, you took some time off for the campaign, and then right after the campaign, you went back to governing. George H.W. Bush, when he was elected president, he ran a vicious campaign against Michael Dukakis. The day it was over, he was on the phone talking to Democrats. All right, campaign's over, let's start working for the country. That's the way it used to be. That isn't the way it works anymore. It hasn't worked that way. The permanent campaign, one campaign just sets up for the next campaign. There's never any time for governing. And that's been extremely harmful. For those of us who are students of American politics and the Senate, the downward spiral, which had been going on for 20 years, we were very aware of it. But I think the public only got aware of it after Barack Obama became president. If you think back to January 2009, he becomes president. We're in the worst economic crisis in 80 years. We lost 750,000 jobs in 1 month. He had a right to think that our national narrative would hold up. The national narrative is we come together in times of crisis. And it didn't happen. The Republicans just opposed him. They opposed everything he wanted to do. And in my mind, that kind of obstruction is quite unpatriotic. And it drove the Senate down further and further. I think a special place in hell is reserved for Mitch McConnell, who I believe to be one of the worst leaders in the history of the country, because partisan political strategy, not what was good for the country, was what was guiding him. So we had those 4 years. And now for the surprise ending. I've spoken in a lot of different places, and wherever I go, I find that people are disgusted with our government, the paralysis, the vitriolic political culture, the 24-hour media, the excess of lobbying, the money-soaked culture. And I think they're all right to be disgusted by it. I've become a relative optimist, relative to everyone else. And the reason for that is I think that the Senate hit bottom in 2012 and has started to come back. I've written a couple of articles on this, which perhaps the first one seemed naive in January. The second one came out on April 1st, so somebody dismissed it as an April Fool's joke. But my basic view is elections do have consequences. Obama's victory and the Senate landslide for the Democrats have changed the dynamic in the Senate. The Republicans feel, many of the Republicans, not all of them, but many of them see the need to compromise on certain things. When you break down that straight party voting, possibilities start to arise. And second, the senators, those who were there and those who were newly elected, they hate what the Senate had become. They don't really think that they were sent to Washington to be part of a diminished, degraded institution. They actually believe they're supposed to be doing the nation's business. And I believe that their desire, and the desire they sum it up by calling for regular order. Regular order means we want to legislate the old way. We want to have hearings. We want to have committee action. We want amendments on the floor. We want a free debate. We want to reach compromises. That's what regular order is. And it's breaking out in the Senate now. So if you read the newspapers, as you do, you see the Gang of Eight working on the immigration bill on a bipartisan basis. You see different senators coming together, even on something as hard as gun control. You see different people talking, Democrat and Republican, talking about banks that are too big to fail, being too big to exist. You see the stirrings of a more bipartisan and a healthier politics. We're not there yet. We're not going to get there overnight, but I think it is happening. The last thing I would say, since this is a Senate speech, this is like a filibuster. The last thing I would say, people ask why I'm so focused on the Senate And obviously I'm interested in it. I wrote a book about it. But it's the only way that I can figure to change our politics rapidly. If you think about it, there are a whole lot of things that we might be able to put on a list that we'd like to change about the political system. Certainly campaign finance, gerrymandered districts, maybe even universal voting, cutting back on lobbying. There are a lot of things we could come up with. They're not going to happen quickly if they happen at all. They're years away. The only thing that can change rapidly is the nature of our leadership in the Congress, and particularly the Senate. It doesn't take that many people to change the Senate. You can change it with 10 or 15 people who decide that they're not going to be blind partisans anymore. That's the kind of change that I think is happening, and that's the reason that I feel relatively optimistic. The last thing I would say, the other thing I said was the next to last thing I would say. The last thing I would say, I really want to thank some of the younger people for being here. Most of my audiences tend to be a little older because they remember the old Senate, and many people are retired, some of the people I speak to, and they have a little more time. But I wrote the book for younger people. I really wanted my daughter and son and their friends to know that it wasn't that long ago that we had a government that actually worked. It wasn't that long ago that we had a Senate that drew people to it. It was a magnet for a lot of us. When I was in the Senate, I didn't know all the people that were there at the time, but wandering the halls were Madeleine Albright and Steve Breyer, Chris Matthews, Mark Shields, senators now Lamar Alexander, Susan Collins, Bill Clinton. A lot of us got our start working in the Senate because it was a great place. And I look forward to the time that we have the next great Senate, or at least a very respectable one, which will attract the same kind of people to it. Thank you all for coming, and love to take questions.